Welcome to the Motivational Talks session for the LHC Early Career Job Matching event. So we are so pleased to have two amazing speakers with us today, Conor Fitzpatrick from LHCB and Toyoko Orimoto from CMS. So what we're going to have today is two short 20-minute talks where each of them is going to sort of share their career path and any nuggets of wisdom that they've learned. I think we're good to start. So Conor Fitzpatrick is joining us from the University of Manchester, where he is both a UKRI Future Fellows leader and an ERC Starting Grant awardee. So with that, Conor, if you could take it away, that would be amazing.
Yeah, thank you very much. And in fact, just to start, thanks to the coordinators for the invitation to give what I hope is a motivational talk. So yeah, I will try and give you some perspectives based on my personal experience, but caveat emptor, personal experience is indeed personal. So all of my career to date so far has been exclusively on the LHCB experiment. I know that for many of you here, you are more likely to be on CMS or Atlas. So it could be that some of my experience doesn't map directly. Also, my experience is mostly based within Europe. So while I will talk about a few places and a few opportunities that exist in Europe, I don't know so much about the US or indeed other regions. I would point out that everyone's journey is different. And I would also point out that you should beware my survivorship bias. What I mean by that, and is expressed nicely by this diagram that I'm sure everyone has seen before, is that I have made it to what is essentially a permanent position. Not everyone does, and my view can only come from what I've seen on my way to this permanent position. So do think a little bit about the advice I give and whether or not it directly maps to your situation as we go through the talk. I will try and point this out as we go along. It has also been 11 years since I was awarded my PhD, and a lot has changed in the world since then. However, to some extent, I'm now familiar with hiring applications and grant panels from the other side of the desk. So I hope that some of my advice, while looking from a different perspective, is somewhat up to date. Where possible, I'll try and give generally applicable advice, and I'll start a little bit with my own journey in high energy physics. So as introduced, I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Manchester. This is a research-focused equivalent position to what we in the UK would normally call a senior lecturer. For those in the US, this is roughly equivalent to what is not normally referred to as an associate professor. So this is a full-time permanent position. Tenure track is not so much a thing that I went through, the reason being that I was awarded a grant that was contingent on me being granted tenure as a result of this grant, if you see what I mean. I have had several roles in LHCB, but I would say my main career highlights so far were during my second postdoctoral position. So before the position that I have now, I think the highest heights I achieved were a project leadership for LHCB's higher level trigger between 2017 and 2020, and a physics analysis working group convenership from 2016 to 2018 in the beauty decays to open charm physics area in LHCB. This is my main area of research, so CP violation in decays of beauty mesons to charm mesons, and the LHCB real-time analysis project, which is what we now call the trigger in LHCB. On these topics, I was awarded an ERC starting grant, which was fantastic. This allowed me to start a team, to hire some excellent postdoctoral researchers, not too dissimilar into the positions that you are probably looking for today. And my permanent position at UOM was the result of this Future Leaders Fellowship that was mentioned earlier. So how did I end up getting here from where many of you are now at the stage of maybe finishing or having just finished a PhD? Well, I was lucky to some extent in that I started my PhD in Edinburgh right at the start of run one. I was in fact based at CERN in just at the end of the first year of my PhD, just before the startup. And this was fantastic because it meant that there was an awful lot of activity and a lot of very smart people often running around looking for people to help them with their work in getting the detector up and running. At the time, I thought, hey, there's all of this buzz going on in the control room. It's a cool place to hang out. So I'll sign up and volunteer for subdetector and central shift duties. And this turned out to be quite a good thing to do from a career perspective, because it's a great place to learn how things work on any given experiment. There's plenty of friendly experts around, particularly during the commissioning period when they've all got jobs to do. And there's lots of downtime while the LHC is commissioning and setting up for beam. So it means that you've got an opportunity to speak to these people, and they're often quite friendly. The reason they're in the control room and hanging about is also because they like it there. So it's a great way to talk to people and find out more. And this gave me a huge head start on the analyses that I was doing, but it also meant that I was able to find some of the first charm meson peaks at LHCD using the early data, just because I was picking up all of this knowledge from these experts in the control room. And this wasn't the core topic of my thesis, but it's probably one of the things on LHCD, at least, that I got known for during my PhD. So after my PhD, or at least nearing the end of my PhD, I took advice from as many people as I could, from postdocs, fellows, senior colleagues, people I was hanging out with at CERN, on what maybe I should be doing next. One of the things that came up often was, yeah, you should consider applying for the CERN fellowship positions. So I did, and I was rejected for the first time. That will be a running theme in this talk, just to let you know. However, I did apply again. So these run every 6 months. I think it's twice a year they hold fellowship application rounds. And on the second time, I was made an offer, which was great. The 2-year fellowship that the CERN fellowship offers is both a huge opportunity, but also it's a little bit hectic because it's quite short. Because it's only 2 years, there's not a lot that you can fit in and also apply for the positions immediately afterwards. So while you can choose to work on any CERN-approved experiment, you don't really have that much time to learn a new experiment from the ground up. So from a compromise standpoint, I decided, well, look, I'll stick with LHCD, but I do want to distinguish myself in my fellowship. I want to show that I'm capable of doing more than just more of the same. So I changed both my analysis and subdetector activities. The biggest adaptation, I think, throughout the fellowship was being expected to work independently. So this is true in most postdoc positions, but I think it is exceptionally true in the CERN fellowship positions, that you are effectively your own researcher now. You can choose to work on what you work on, you can decide how you work, and you don't really have anyone looking over your shoulder. So what I did instead to kind of make up for that was to look for some really good teams who are doing interesting stuff and work with them. And that made it much easier because it meant that now I had kind of a cohort of colleagues that I was relying on, they were relying on me. We were all very friendly, and it meant that we could lean on each other for advice and support when needed. Those 2 years passed extremely quickly, and I was applying for jobs very early in the second year already. So realistically, you kind of have 1 year to start making an impact before you're already putting in applications for the next thing. So for the second postdoc, I applied for several positions towards the end of the fellowship and had quite limited success. So I put my name in for one of the longer term CERN LD 5-year positions. I also applied for individual research funding as a fellow through this Dutch VAMI fellowship program. And I applied for a postdoctoral researcher position at École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, which is just up the road from CERN in a very beautiful part of Switzerland on the lake. Of these, only the Lausanne post was successful, but this was great anyway because it was a 5-year position and it was reasonably close to CERN. You could ask me how I commuted. I think some of the coordinators of the ECSF might know already. What was new to me in this position was that now, unlike the CERN fellowship, I had teaching responsibilities. So I ran a project for 4th-year students where I had to supervise their day-to-day activities, train them on the equipment, which was a mini particle accelerator, a little Van de Graaff accelerator that we've got at EPFL. And I supervised a PhD student under the main supervision of their main supervisor, who was one of the professors at EPFL. Also during this time was when I was appointed the project leader and the working group convener roles, which meant that with all of these things piled on top of what I would consider to be a normal research load, I suddenly had very little time. And because I was considering what my next steps were, I was also spending the little free time that I had left over after all of this trying to apply for permanent positions. So reaching the last hurdle, I encountered the bus problem. So as the saying goes, you wait ages for a bus and then three come along at once. There's actually quite a bit of research on this topic. The New Scientist link that I have highlighted here tells you that this is a real thing and that it can be modeled, at least for buses. In my case, what I mean by this is that in the year before my last at Lausanne, I applied for a whole bunch of jobs. I applied for 3 fellowships, 3 lectureships, a lab post in a French facility, and all of these were unsuccessful. So that was 7 job applications in the next to final year. And I saw rejection at every stage. So I was running out of road in my last year of the contract with EPFL. And of course, this could be seen to be quite disheartening. Now, the nice thing was that what kept me going was my research was great fun. I was having an enormously enjoyable time, a productive time working with quite large teams, both as the convener and as the project leader roles, which was a nice thing to fall back on, or at least to look back on while I was continuing to apply. I reached out to colleagues. I asked them for support. I asked them, do you see anything pathological with what I'm doing with my applications that might result in so many rejections? And in the end, their advice, their friendship, and their ability to think critically about what I had written was what helped me to put in one last round of applications. I figured that, I'll try this and then I'll be done. I'll have finished my contract at EPFL and I'll start looking for work outside of high energy physics. However, with that last round, suddenly everything fell into place and the bus problem arrived. 3 came along at once. So I accepted a CERN LD position, and then very shortly afterwards was awarded this Future Leaders Fellowship at Manchester and the ERC starting grant, which of course left me with an interesting problem to solve, which was, do I stay at CERN? Do I take up the role in Manchester? What do I do about the starting grant? Do I move it to CERN? Do I move it to Manchester? What do I do there? There were many questions, but all of these were positive questions. It was a good problem to have. In the end, I decided that I would end my CERN LD post early, move to Manchester and try and start setting up my own group here. So what I took from this was that my second postdoc was something of a roller coaster. It was plenty of ups, plenty of downs, and on average, I think it had more ups than downs. So I feel quite good about the overall experience. So what did I learn on my journey? I think the main things that you can take from each of my career stages are as follows on this slide. The first thing I think is that, even at the level of PhD, but also thereafter, volunteering for things that you think personally are interesting, even if others don't, or even if it doesn't seem like an obvious career transition move, often pays off. Seizing the moment is important. So with Run 1 commissioning, this was a nice opportunity for me to get involved in some interesting and relatively important work at the time. However, it's also important to point out that, with the next few years, the HLLHC is coming. So similar opportunities will be available for you to seize if you wish. Important topics aren't necessarily the high profile ones. So if you find a need and try and fill it and you enjoy doing it, it can often turn out to be quite exciting. Similarly, the work I became known for in the end was not strongly coupled to my thesis topic. From the fellowship, what I learned was that it's always good to reach out to teams or colleagues that you might want to work with on topics in future, people that you enjoy hanging out with, that you enjoy and share productive conversations with whenever you're doing your research. You'll benefit from their support as you're trying to find independence away from your thesis advisor. Short contracts mean that you are thinking about your next steps already. So once you're in one of these roles, because it's so short, it's really worth planning, okay, what am I going to do next? And how do I best achieve the goals necessary to get to that next stage? It's worth thinking about changing it up. So changing the analysis or subdetector activities that you do. This allowed me to draw a line under my PhD and broaden my experience. You don't have to change everything. You can change 1 or 2 things, but as long as you can demonstrate that you are broadening your overall experience, I think this looks very good to future job applications. And then what I learned eventually from applying for grants and fellowships is that at this level, you will have good ideas, but so will a lot of other applicants. Don't be disheartened by rejection and keep buying lottery tickets, because eventually it will pay off. Senior colleagues, such as myself in this instance, will have been there too. They'll understand, they'll be supportive, they'll give you the time you need to write applications, and they'll help you in any way that they can. So was it worth it? Well, hopefully you've gotten an idea from what I've said so far about my journey from PhD to senior research fellow. Personally, I think I got to work in and eventually lead some amazing teams of incredible people doing really interesting research. Personally, I learned a lot, not just about high energy physics, but also about how I work and how to work well with others, which I think is super important in our career paths. We all work in very large collaborations. We all need to find our way in these collaborations. Building a team of friends that you can rely on and that you can work well with together is a super important part of that. Despite this, my career progression to date did have its downsides. I spent 8 years in insecure employment. I spent very long hours writing applications under the shadow of past rejections, of which there were many, many more than there were successes. And ultimately, you do end up in situations where you think, well, what is my next step? What happens if this application doesn't work out? What really helped and what kept me going was definitely the support of the people that I was working with. So do I think it was worth it? Well, in the end, absolutely. You, however, might wish to think carefully about whether or not it's worth it for you. Everyone is different in this regard. The amount of stress people are willing to take and how well they adapt to work under stress is something that we should all consider, be aware of, and also realize that this is not a problem and shouldn't be a problem in our field, but sometimes it becomes that way, and we should learn how we cope with it when it happens. So with all that said, if you have decided to apply for a postdoc, how do you go about finding one? Well, the first point of call is probably the Inspire job search, which is usually very well populated. The link that I provide here is directly to postdoc jobs on the Inspire HEP page, and you can see there's quite a long list available right now. Usually experiments also advertise on internal mailing lists. There are excellent fora, such as the job matching event that we're all attending today, and also word of mouth. If you know who you want to work with, you can always give them a ring and ask them. Most professors that are on your experiment or that you've had some contact with before, either through a shared analysis or through working in the same working group, will be very happy to talk to you about opportunities that they either have available now or that they might have on the horizon. So what should you think about whenever you're choosing who to apply to, which is the next stage once you've come up with a list of things that you've decided on? Firstly, does the job description appeal to you? There's not much point in applying to things that you think, well, I have no interest in that particular area of research. Do you know the group already, or do you know people who have worked in that group before that you can maybe ask about it in a neutral manner? Get their opinion on how that group functions, what the support is like, what opportunities are available to postdocs within the group. Where is it? Is it going to be a position that's hosted by a specific institute, but mostly based at CERN? Or are you going to be able to travel to CERN or to where your experiment ends up being in the long run? These are the kinds of questions that it's worth thinking about, worth checking the job description for. But ultimately, don't be afraid to ask. So contact the group if anything is unclear in the job. This always works in your favor, I would say. You learn more about the role, but also the group that you're perhaps thinking of applying to also finds out that, yes, there is an enthusiastic candidate out there that we should talk more to. So it's a win-win. Lastly, what are you willing to compromise on? Ultimately, every job application is in itself a compromise. I don't think there is a unicorn job for anyone out there that's absolutely perfect and that comes with an extra few zeros on the end of the pay packet. So you're going to have to think about whether or not you want to take the time to apply to this specific role. You shouldn't probably apply to jobs that you think are a bad fit, but it is worth being a little careful not to miss out by being too inflexible. So if you decide that your red lines are that it must be based in this particular part of the world, it must have the following requirements and it must allow me to do the following research, you may end up narrowing things down to the extent that there aren't that many positions out there. And if you don't get that position when you do apply for it, you could be scrambling to apply for things later on down the line. When you've made that decision, whenever you've narrowed down your choice to a few and you begin to start putting in applications, the advice I have to you based on my experience in applying to jobs is that you have or you will soon have a PhD. You are smart. I think it's safe to say that everyone in attendance here today is smart and is enthusiastic. But so are your colleagues. Bear that in mind. Almost everyone in particle physics after the position that you're in now has a PhD. So don't let your ego prevent you from reaching out to them. Don't be kind of, oh, this is my own struggle. This is my own idea that I must bring forward and deliver alone. You can reach out and get help. Feel free to share your applications and your CV with colleagues as early as possible in the process, and do accept feedback and constructive criticism. It will make your applications better, and it will make you feel better about what you're applying for, because you'll know that you have the support of people behind you. Similarly, make sure you practice interviews. You can arrange to do this with your thesis advisor, with friends, in front of a mirror, with colleagues, in front of your cat, whatever you're comfortable with, to get used to the idea of how these interviews might go and how comfortable you are in speaking. It's also important to learn from rejection, but it's equally important, I think, to learn from success. So either way, what questions after an interview, for example, did you feel that you could have answered better? And how would you answer them better in future? And make a note of the questions you're asked, make a note of potential model answers that you would like to give in future, and check these with your friends to make sure that they make sense. Similarly, request feedback. It's not always useful feedback. From my experience of the rejections, a lot of them, the feedback was sufficiently vague that it was very hard to tell if there was something I needed to fix. But on rare occasions, you will get very good feedback that helps you improve your future applications. Based on my experience from interviewing applicants, some things that I would like to point out. First of all, it's very easy to undersell, particularly at the first stage of your career. So when you're just finishing your PhD, it's very common to see applications in which PhD students who want to become postdocs write things like, I did this work in a team doing X, or I worked as part of a team doing X. When in fact, that's not so useful to someone who's planning on hiring you, because what they want to know is what you specifically did. So rather than I worked in a team doing X, it's much better to say something like, I worked in the team that did X, where I was responsible for specifically doing task Y. And that gives them a much better idea of what it is that you've done, what you're capable of, and whether or not that's a good fit to the group that they're hiring you into. Similarly, I co-authored this paper is not so useful. Saying I co-authored this paper in which I was responsible for these sections, or the work that was carried out in these sections, is much more useful. And even more useful than that is explaining a little bit what that work was, what you did, and why it was useful to the overall paper itself. Similarly, know who or where you're applying to. So make sure you read up about the group, what they're working on, know the job description, know the people that are likely to be on the panel and what they're working on, what interests them, and be prepared to talk about how your ideas and your plans fit within the current activities of the group. So hopefully you find success. So what do you need to think about whenever you're starting your first postdoc? Well, your first position post-PhD is your chance to show independence. You're likely going to have some directed work in your new group, but you'll also have some freedom to do what you personally are interested in. Consider how to show that you've moved beyond your thesis topic using that free time. So the additional research that you do, you're going to want to either branch out from your research topic or change topic depending. As a PhD student, your advisor helps by guiding you. You don't necessarily have as much of that as a postdoc. Hopefully you have a good supervisor or boss in your postdoc position, but there will be a self-direction element, and you can supplement that by making sure that you have a good working relationship with the team that you work with, and that you share ideas and are prepared to accept ideas that aren't necessarily your own as being good ideas going forward. Do make sure to find time to do things outside your direct research area. So again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the big things that helped me was taking control room shifts. Get yourself involved in various task forces that are solving problems on your experiment, or help with problems or analyses that others are stuck on, where they're welcoming of your work. You'll make new friends. You'll also be able to learn who are the experts to ask for help with your own work at a later stage as well. And it may even change your career path. Lastly, it pays to pay it forward. You're likely going to be working with and guiding PhD students in future, so help others with their work and job hunting when the time comes, because I'm sure you'll appreciate it when people help you right now. So to conclude, I've tried to provide you with some pointers based on my personal journey in high energy physics career, but everyone's journey will be different. Some things are constant, and I hope that I've tried to address those here, but only you can decide what steps you're going to take on your own journey. Do, however, reach out to colleagues for advice and make sure that they think you're on the right track as well. The take-home message, however, above all, is to have fun. The type of fun is up to you. So the fun scale on the right here is a good example. Whether you enjoy type 1, type 2, or type 3 fun is purely down to your personality, but make sure that it is fun when you're doing it. You'll do your best work while you're enjoying it. Lastly, if you're interested in postdocs on the LHCb experiment, I will be advertising positions shortly. You can feel free to contact me at this email address for any questions either on this talk or on a potential future career. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Connor, for the super honest and also really deep advice. So I ask everyone to save their questions for after Toyoko's talk, and we'll have people raise their hands then. But thank you so much. All right, so next up we have Professor Toyoko Orimoto coming to us. She's an associate professor with a CMS experiment at Northeastern University. All right, and so we can see your slides.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak to you. First of all, I want to say that I agree with everything Connor said, so listen to him. And hopefully the information that I share will be somewhat overlapping, but also complementary to his advice. So first, I'll speak a little bit about my personal journey, and I'll start with who I am. So my name is Toyoko Orimoto. I am an associate professor of physics at Northeastern University. I'm a particle physicist. I was born in Los Angeles, California, but now I reside in Boston to work at my university, which is in Boston. I also identify as a second generation Japanese American. That means that my parents are from Japan, but immigrated to the US, and I was the first one born in the United States. I also identify as a woman of color, a mother to 2 young children, as well as a teacher, advisor, and mentor to many. So part of the reason I started by talking about some aspects of my identity is because I believe that we all have many identities, and we bring those identities with us wherever we go, whether it be the lab or to a job interview, classroom, etc. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that both as a job seeker and a job recruiter. And I'll kind of talk a little bit about my different identities and how they relate to my career path. So zooming in a little bit more on my identity as a particle physicist, I'll tell you a little bit more about my academic background as we go along. But here I wanted to emphasize that I am a member of the CMS collaboration and have been since 2006. And some of my recent roles in CMS include being the current system manager of the CMS electromagnetic calorimeter. And also I was recently co-chair of the CMS Diversity and Inclusion Office. So these are 2 areas of work that I'm really passionate about. So how did I get here to becoming a professor at a university in the US? So as I mentioned, I was born, I don't know if I can see my cursor. As I mentioned, I was born in Los Angeles, California. I spent most of my life in California. Then I went to CERN and finally came to Boston as a professor. So how did that journey begin? As I mentioned that I'll speak a little bit about my identities. As a child, I grew up working class, and I really had no idea what a scientist was or did until I got to around middle school or high school. And when I was in high school, one really exciting thing that happened was that the top quark was discovered at Fermilab. And its discovery in 1995 is really what inspired me to be a particle physicist. Just like for many of you, I think the discovery of the Higgs boson and movies like Particle Fever may have inspired you as well. So I feel really fortunate to have discovered a love of particle physics at a fairly young age when I was around 16. I caught the bug then and basically have never have had it ever since. Again, as I mentioned, I grew up working class, and honestly, I lived in poverty and had a lot of hardship when I was young in my tween and teenage years. And in a lot of ways, physics for me is what really saved my life. And I sometimes think about the different paths I could have taken, and discovering physics in high school was something that really changed my life. I grew up without a lot of access to things that other people had. So for example, I had to navigate college applications on my own. I had to get a job in high school so that I could afford even the applications, so that I could afford to take the SATs, and these are entrance exams and whatnot. But one thing that I was really fortunate to have access to in California is a world-class public higher education system. So the University of California system is a public system that all people who live in California have access to. So I was really fortunate to get a full scholarship to go to UC Berkeley, which I didn't realize at the time is arguably one of the world's top universities for physics and also particle physics. One really great thing about being a student at Berkeley is that I was exposed to so many research opportunities. As an undergraduate, I had experiences working on D0 and Atlas. And in fact, I came to CERN in 1999 for the first time as a summer student. So there I got the bug for the LHC and kind of kept my eyes on that throughout my career. I really thrived in physics at Berkeley, and I chose to stay there for my PhD. So typically in the United States, I know it's different in Europe and elsewhere, but in the US, it's typically advised that you go to a different institution for your PhD than you did for your undergraduate work. The idea is that, you know, by moving institutions, you can expand your horizons, make larger networks, etc. Um, Many of us at Berkeley end up choosing to stay at Berkeley for various reasons, which for me nonetheless worked out. So there I did not heed the advice of my mentors, but it all kind of worked well. For my PhD, I worked on the Babar experiment, which was an experiment studying matter asymmetry at SLAC, which is a lab close to Berkeley by Stanford University. Of course, that study was completely obfuscated by my dissertation title. um, but anyways, part of the reason I mentioned the different experiments I worked on is because I always encourage my students to take opportunities to work in new areas whenever they can and whenever it's reasonable. So I think my experience was really different from Conor's, where Conor has been on LHCb for a long time, and I've kind of been on I've had experiences with D0 and Atlas. I worked on Babar, and now I work on CMS. Nowadays, people can do, you know, their entire career, undergraduate, PhD, postdoctoral work, and professor on the same experiment, which I think is, you know, really great. Also, you can be a super expert in the thing that you do, but I think working in different areas can be a really fruitful experience. So if you don't have the opportunity to be in different collaborations, you can do as Conor suggested, which is to kind of work on different subdetectors, to work on different physics areas. I think that could be really a good experience. After my PhD, I finally returned to CERN as a postdoc. So I mentioned when I was a summer student in '99 at CERN, I decided that I really wanted to work at the LHC. In fact, during the summer student lectures, Fabiola gave a really awesome talk about the LHC, which I still remember to this day, and it got me really excited about working at CERN. It wasn't reasonable during the time scale as a PhD student for me to work on LHC, so I returned as a postdoc, first as a fellow at Caltech, and then as a CERN fellow and each of those positions were for 3 years. So I was at Caltech for 3 years, and then at CERN for 3 years. As Conor also mentioned, I feel really fortunate to have arrived at CERN during this time period in 2006. So I was able to participate, for example, in test beam studies for the CMS eCal before it went underground. And also I was able to participate in the commissioning of the detector in 2008. You see a picture up on the top of us celebrating at 0.5. And then again, commissioning of the detector in 2010, which is the picture you see on the bottom. And then I was also at CERN for the discovery of the Higgs boson. So, you know, what great timing. I also think that you are in a really great special point in time as well. So you have the opportunity, for example, to participate in the operation of the current detectors at Run 3. There's plenty of data to analyze. So if you're a postdoc or a grad student and you have a kind of a short timeline that you need to get things done, you know, we already have lots of data on tape. There's really interesting upgrades for phase 2 to work on. And then in addition, you may be around to operate the upgraded detector at high luminosity, right? And there's also the opportunity right now to work on R&D for future colliders like FCC or the Muon Collider. So I think that you are also in this really interesting point in time for the LHC and for particle physics. And I really encourage you to think about that and take those opportunities. So that brings me to my present position as a professor at Northeastern. I joined the faculty in 2012, and then I got tenure and became an associate professor in 2019. And I've also recently applied to become a full professor, so hopefully I'll be a full professor soon. If you're interested, I'll be speaking about research opportunities with my group during the individual talk sessions, and you can look at my slides if you can't attend. But here I showcase a bit of my work as a professor. So physics-wise, I primarily am interested in using the Higgs boson as a probe for new physics, in particular in final states that involve photons. And then detector-wise, I work on the ECAL, as I mentioned, and as well as the new timing detector for high luminosity LHC. One of the best things about my job as a professor is the opportunity to work with postdocs and students. So I kind of showcase some pictures of my group and myself doing our work at CERN. And my group members, I'm always surprised at how much my group members inspire me and keep me excited about my research. That's one really great thing about my job, I think. I wanted to emphasize and end this personal portion of my talk by acknowledging that, in some ways I have my dream job, the job that I dreamed of when I was a high school student. But there's also been a lot of ups and downs in my path. I'm not going to go into all the details, but for example, most recently, the pandemic was really a low point for me. And especially the early years of the pandemic were really challenging and even really deeply traumatizing for me. Also, being a professor has turned out to be a more complex job than I initially understood, some ways more satisfying, in some ways more difficult than I thought. And then also, of course, being a working parent is really challenging. I have two young kids. One of them is 9 and the other is 6. So for example, I travel to CERN twice a month, and that's been really challenging, but also really, really great. So that's really tough. And over the years, my career has expanded in its dimensions in ways that I'm really glad about. So for example, I do a lot of work now promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in our field, and that has been really meaningful for me. And overall, I still have the same enthusiasm for particle physics that I had as a teenager. Like I said, I have ups and downs, and sometimes I'm feeling really amped. Like when I got this tour of Proto Dude, I was just like, I totally nerded out. I was so excited. But there's also low points as well. But overall, nearly every day, I feel really fortunate to have, my quote unquote dream job. So moving on to more advice about pursuing a career in particle physics. And I think the advice I'm giving is kind of generic enough that you can apply it to whether you're applying for PhD or postdoc positions or even other future positions, or also non-academic jobs as well. But as Conor emphasized, I have this survivorship bias. So first of all, my point of view is slanted towards academia, but also, of course, like I'm enthusiastic. I'm a tenured professor who has this job for life, right? So I try to kind of keep that in mind with my advice. So next steps. I think most of you are here because you're ready and thinking about your next steps. And a couple points I want to emphasize, and things that I feel like people didn't really tell me when I was a student, is that graduate school is really hard. Being a postdoc is really hard. And part of why I want to say that is because when I was a graduate student, I thought I was the only one suffering. And it turns out most of us have a hard time at some point in our careers. Many of us struggle with mental and physical health issues, among other things, during these really challenging periods of our careers. So for example, I really struggled with mental as well as physical health issues from overwork when I was a grad student, so much so that I took a year off. And I feel like, these are things that we don't often talk about. So I wanted to emphasize that here. Also, many of us experience things like imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is that feeling that is a psychological experience where you feel that you're a fraud and that people are going to eventually expose you as a fraud. And this is something that I experience almost every day. And it makes especially being a grad student or being a postdoc really difficult. And for many of us, at this junction, applying to grad school or postdoc or whatever, it's a period for us to decide what to do next. But also for many of us, it's like a way to put off your bigger decisions, right? Which I think is totally fine. I felt really bad about that when I was applying to grad school. I was mostly applying to grad school because I had no idea what else to do. And I think that's totally fine. I think that's a really reasonable thing to do. I think the thing that I would really like to encourage you to think about at this point, at this juncture, is whether you still love particle physics. So it's interesting for me that Connor used the word grind, because I also, think of it as a grind. Like, if the grind of graduate school or being a postdoc didn't take away your love of physics, then I really encourage you to consider applying for a postdoc or faculty your next step. The reason I emphasize this is because a lot of my students come to me and, at the end of your PhD, you're so tired, you've, been ground down in XYZ ways. It's a really difficult kind of point in your career. And so my advice to my students is always like, despite all of those hardships, like, do you still love particle physics? Like, do you still get excited about the physics that we do? If so, then I really encourage you to apply for a postdoc position, because being a postdoc is really different from being a graduate student in the ways that Connor mentioned. And a lot of the things that were painful in grad school get easier as a postdoc, and that's something that I didn't realize when I was applying to postdoc positions. Again, when I was applying for postdoc positions, I was like, I don't know what else to do. I love physics. I'm going to try this out. And I really, really deeply enjoyed being a postdoc. So I'm going to go into more kind of advice for your next steps. First of all, I know it's really corny to say, but networking is really important. Another way to think of that is that the people you meet now at CERN, at schools, at conferences here today, these people are going to be your colleagues in the future. These are the people who will be giving you your jobs, writing letters for your promotions, inviting you to conferences, etc. So that's something to keep in mind. And it's really good if you take the opportunity at these places to meet people and network. And network could just be, like introducing yourself to someone and talking about your research. It doesn't have to be so formal. Another thing that I've heard is all talks are job talks. And now that I've been on the other side of employing people, I really think that that's something that's true and something that I'd like to emphasize. So whenever you have the opportunity to give a talk in front of a large audience, you should keep that in mind and obviously do your best. Speaking of networks, it's really important to develop a network of mentors. So you will need mentors throughout your career, even as a senior scientist. That's something that I didn't realize when I was younger. I thought you become a tenured professor and you're like, I'm good, right? But I still need mentors. And even after I become a full professor, I'm still going to need mentors. And it's also valuable to have more than one mentor to get multiple perspectives. Another thing that I've realized is that sometimes your best mentors and greatest champions are going to be people who look nothing like you, who are really dissimilar from you. And many of us who are minorities in one way or another have no choice but to find mentors that don't, look like us. So for example, as a woman, I spent many years primarily focusing on trying to find women mentors because I really identify strongly with my identity as a woman. But at some point, when you get higher in your career, there's really not that many women around, unfortunately, right? Those numbers are getting better, but when you get to the faculty level, it's 10% women. And so if those few women, they don't have time to, of course, like mentor all of the women in our field. And also, it's not necessarily their work. It's an additional burden for them to do that. And honestly, the people who are in the more privileged position should be the ones who support us. And I've realized that many of my strongest mentors, my greatest champions, were people who look nothing like me. And that was really eye-opening for me. Another thing, which is, kind of generic, but I think is really important, is really to be respectful and professional. First of all, it's the right thing to do. Second of all, in our field, potential employers are typically looking for people who can work with others. So I've been on the, search committee in CMS for a few years, where we try to find people to fill level 1, level 2, level 3 leadership roles. And interpersonal skills are really important. The way that you interact with people are really important, right? We work in a very collaborative field. So that's something that's, really valued. And it's something you can work on as well. So for example, I came to CERN like being really shy and really not like it, not really feeling comfortable talking to new people. And I really worked on that. And I've become much more at ease with meeting new people and networking. Also, you probably already know this, but it's a lot easier to get people to do things for you by being nice than by being mean. So say you finally get that level 3 or level 2 leadership role, right? And you need to kind of convince people to do things. That's part of what your leadership role is about. I think that I tend to want to reply and get things done for people who are really kind to me, and people who are not nice to me, I like procrastinating, right? So something to keep in mind. A few more pieces of advice for job seekers. Connor already sort of mentioned this, but I think it's really important to follow your passions. Another way to think of this, it sounds really like corny and generic, but a more practical way to think of this is that even if you don't end up getting a dream job, at least you enjoyed the work that you did, right? So students often come to me saying, well, I have the opportunity to do X, Y, or Z. Like, what's the thing that I should do? What's the thing that's going to help me get my next job? And I always advise them, like, do the thing that you're most excited about, because doing plan A is not necessarily going to guarantee you any job, right? But if you do the thing that you're really excited about, at least you will have had a good time. At least you would have had fun. And I also think that most people do their best when they're excited about their work. Also, start thinking about your long-term plans. So, I think this is more so for the more senior people. For grad students, you don't have to think about your 10-year plan yet. But when you're applying to faculty jobs, you'll need to think about your 2 to 3, 5 to 10+ year plan, because when you apply for grant funding, 3 to 5 years is the time scale that the proposals are for. And I also think it's a sign of your maturity as a scientist to start thinking long term. So if you're a graduate student now, then I would encourage you to think about your 1+2 plus 2+3+ year plans. If you're a postdoc already and applying for your next postdoc, start thinking longer term. And then balance, make sure you have a good balance of work that you do. So in the United States, it's really important that you have a balance between your physics analysis as well as detector work. Nowadays, it's really valued to also be working on one of the detector upgrades or something related to high luminosity LHC. And then there's also other work that you can balance. So for example, if you have a passion for teaching, mentoring, outreach, D&I related work, then you can add that to that balance as well. When it comes to job applications, you should highlight your accomplishments. So again, emphasizing what Connor had said, you want to be modest and avoid exaggerations, but really highlight the things that you did. You should tailor your application to the specific institute that you're applying to. So, for example, if you're applying to Northeastern, make sure that you research the group that you are interested in working with. Research a bit about the university, what makes that university unique, and tailor your statement to the needs of that specific institute or the unique characteristics of that institute. So definitely reach out to your potential employers and inquire about the position. We get dozens of applications for postdoc positions, so it's really great to make yourself stand out. And in the worst case scenario, the person will write to you. They're never going to be like, no, like, don't apply, or they're not going to say anything bad. They will most likely, in the worst case, they won't reply. In the best case, you'll connect with them and make yourself stand out. Definitely get advice from mentors, the network of mentors that you develop. So this is something Connor also mentioned, and also be sure to give them sufficient time for feedback. So sometimes my students are like, I need a letter of recommendation by Monday, and that's really like unprofessional. Make sure you give plenty of time. Speaking of letters, make sure you get letters from people who really know you. So sometimes I get letters from the spokespersons of experiments for people that it's very obvious in a letter if they don't know you well. And so make sure you get letters from people who know you, and that the letters showcase your kind of varied talents. So if you have 3 letters, if one of them talks about mostly your physics, get one that talks about your detector work, etc. So make sure there's a balance. And one thing that I didn't realize also is that you should make sure you set aside good time. So a strong application takes a lot of time to prepare, and you should make sure you kind of block off a good time in order to do all of that. One thing that I want to emphasize was, as you become a more mature scientist and you apply for postdoc positions and faculty positions, is that you should start thinking about what your research vision is. So basically, what are the major questions you're trying to answer in your research? So it can just be like kind of like an elevator pitch of what you're working on. And it's good to revisit that vision every year or few years. So this vision is basically like, the reason why I suggest this is because when you write a statement, a research statement, or eventually a grant proposal, you want some kind of coherent vision that ties together all the different pieces of your work, your physics work, your detector work, etc. And so that vision is going to tie all of that together to make a really interesting narrative. When it comes to job interviews, do your homework. So I think this is something that Connor mentioned. Read up on the institution, the department, the group. Is you could also read up on the individuals you'll be interviewing with. Prepare an elevator pitch. So be ready with a couple sentences, nutshell summary of your research. Sometimes I've been in interviews where people are just like, tell me about yourself. So you should be prepared for that. Ask questions. So it's an opportunity for you to learn more about that institute and find out if it's a good match for you. Also, if you feel stuck in an interview, asking questions is a good way to kind of get out of a bind. Sometimes I get really nervous during interviews, but one thing that I realized I could do is ask people questions, because people generally love talking about their research in academia. And if you're asked to give a presentation, it should be very polished, and you should be sure to rehearse that talk. So job offers. The one thing I want to emphasize here is that there are so many factors that are involved in the hiring process. So, Connor mentioned some of the ups and downs that he had, not getting certain fellowship, etc. And, when you don't get a job, or don't get an interview, you should take, I don't want you to take it too much to heart, because there's so many applicants, there's so many different factors beyond whether you're an excellent candidate or not. Also, if you get to an interview, just getting an interview is an accomplishment in itself. So by that time, there are several really excellent candidates, and oftentimes it could be any of the candidates who get the job, but there are different kind of things going on behind the scenes. And we're all disappointed at some point in the job application process during our careers. So, as Connor mentioned, you should apply for a reasonable number of positions to expand your potential outcomes. And last but not least, if you're in the fortunate position to have received an offer, you can negotiate. So I always expect my postdoc candidates to negotiate. It doesn't mean that I will be able to give you what you're asking for. But by the time you get to the job offer, we've put so much work into this process that it's not like I'm going to be like, never mind, you don't get your job anymore. We're going to try our best to give you what you want if you're the top candidate. And so you can always ask for things. There should be a good reason for the things you ask, but you can always negotiate. So that brings me to my conclusion. If you're going to take away one thing, don't forget that you're all very talented. I think it's really easy to forget when you're at CERN that a PhD in physics is really special. Sometimes when you're at CERN, you feel like you're a dime a dozen, but then you leave and you realize that your experience is really unique and that you're really talented. So I want you to remember that. And here's an opportunity for you to network. So you can follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter. And then I also post a few resources. The one on top is really interesting, the New England Future Faculty Workshop. So I give talks about how to write your research statement for grad school or postdoc or faculty applications. And so if you go to that Google Drive, there's a video as well as my slide deck, etc., going into a lot more detail about preparing your statements. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Toyoko. That was an amazing and also incredibly in-depth and complimentary talk to Connor's. So fabulous. Okay. Oh, and I see lots of virtual claps going around. So thank you so much. All right, so it's 2 p.m. So I think with that,